Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thanks to the organizer for inviting me. I'm sorry to drag you away from this wonderful nutrition break. I've got to say it's the best nutrition break I've ever seen at a conference. At academic conferences in my field, and I'm sure Dr. Merzenich will echo this, you're lucky just to get some ice water. So thank you for this. So I'm going to be talking to you about building blocks of mathematical competence. One of the most common reactions I get when I tell people that I study how children develop mathematical abilities is that they say, oh, I always struggled with it. I had math problems. In society, we have great anxiety about mathematics. And I also experience this at my university. I have a course entitled The Development of the Mathematical Brain. And I've often heard that students choose not to enroll in that course because they think I'm going to be asking them to learn math. I'm not going to be asking you to learn math today, but I want you to consider what the latest science tells us about how children acquire basic mathematical competence. I'm going to start by, if this clicker works. Yeah, great. I'm going to start by just asking you to consider how much we use our basic numerical and mathematical abilities in our everyday lives. So, for example, when you go to the grocery store, one of your aims is hopefully going to be that you want to keep your family healthy, and we heard a lot about the benefits of nutrition and eating well today already. And if it's a busy evening on a weeknight, you might rush into the store and just grab a quantity of apples that you think will suffice for the days ahead. That's sort of your approximate ability to use number, but you're using a sense of quantity to guide your decision, but you're not necessarily thinking about that. On a Saturday morning, you might go to the farmer's market, you have way more time, and you might count out the apples to get the exact number of fruit that you want to have for the forthcoming week. Then you're again using number abilities, but now you're using your exact sense of number. This example just illustrates how often we rely on our basic numerical and mathematical abilities to guide our decisions in our everyday lives. For most of us, the day starts with this kind of display. If I'd seen this display this morning, I would have been in a sheer state of panic because I would have missed an important appointment. But this is just another example to illustrate that we rely on our ability to understand numbers and numerical relations and numerical symbols to guide our decision making. There's lots of research to suggest that our numerical abilities, I have to get used to the delay in this clicker, that our numerical abilities are not something that's necessarily uniquely human. Consider this scene on the top of this screen and think about as if you were a lion or a tiger and it's lunchtime and you're very hungry. And this scene actually looks very appetizing to you. But you've got some decisions to make. You've got to decide which group of these animals to approach. And one of the cues you might use is the distance between you and the animals, but another cue might be how many are in a particular group. And so you're using, again, a basic sense of quantity to guide your decision making. And there's now lots of evidence, and I'll share some more with you, that suggests that animals share with us a basic sense of quantity, that they have some rudimentary numerical capacities. So in a sense, our numerical capacities are evolutionary ancient. Another example is the weather. Every day we look at the weather, and it's been glorious in Vancouver. I'm so glad to be here right now because of this wonderful weather. And if we look at these kinds of displays, we make, again, rapid decisions on the basis of what we're seeing, what we're going to wear, what we're going to put in our children's rucksack, because it might rain later in the afternoon. So we don't just look at single numbers, but we also consider relationships between numbers, trends over time that inform our decision making. But in this case, you're probably not thinking, oh, I'm using my numerical abilities. But if you don't have those basic numerical abilities, you would struggle in these everyday situations. Another example, of course, is the stock market, and we rely in part on the decisions that other people make about numbers. If we've got pension funds, their decision-making and their numerical abilities influence us in important ways. So another example where numeracy is critically important. And perhaps most important, numbers are really critical in sports. I am German, and this number will forever stick in my mind. It's one of the best numerical relationships that I have ever seen. And yes, let's go Blue Jays tonight, right? Let's see some good numbers there too. So that also illustrates that numbers have emotional valence to us as well. So we mustn't always think about numbers just in the context of formal education, but also the critical roles that they play in our everyday lives and what happens if we lose our numerical abilities or if we struggle to acquire the most basic numerical skills. So how important is numeracy? There's been a large discourse over the last 40 years or so about the importance of literacy. And there's lots of data to suggest that acquiring basic reading skills is a fundamental competence that all children need to have in order to succeed in life. We've now seen that there's lots of reports to suggest that the same is true for numeracy. For example, Binner and Parson, in a study carried out in the UK in 2005, were able to demonstrate that low numeracy is associated with risk for unemployment, physical illness, depression, and even incarceration. That doesn't necessarily mean that low numeracy causes those negative outcomes, but it's certainly correlated with those negative outcomes. We also know from the wonderful work of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, who run the famous PISA study, that improvements in mathematical competence within a country over time are related to economic growth. So the PISA study is carried out every so often, so they've got longitudinal data, and therefore they can link longitudinal educational outcome data to economic data and show direct relationships between the two. KPMG reported, commissioned by the UK government, that low numeracy cost the UK government an estimated 2.4 billion sterling pounds per year in lost tax revenue, due to having to employ people from abroad, et cetera, not having people who've got the essential skills. So there's a high cost, a high economic cost to low numeracy as well. Another domain in which numeracy is very important, and a domain that you may not associate with being numerical literacy, is actually healthcare. There are lots of studies now showing that a nurse who's mathematically illiterate or who doesn't have good mathematical skills will make wrong decisions. Consider a busy emergency room on a Friday evening. There's lots of emergencies coming in. The nurse or the doctor or any healthcare provider has to rapidly read off numbers off a chart and translate them into decisions, and maybe even perform some rudimentary calculations with those numbers. If you've got a deficit in low-level numeracy, you're going to mess that up, and that's going to have consequences for your patients. It also affects patients. Patients who have low numerical abilities may not be able to follow prescriptions, as well as those who have relatively high numerical abilities. So these statistics just serve to illustrate how important numeracy is. Now, I'm very interested in the development of early numeracy skills, because I believe that if we can better understand what drives numerical development early, then we can intervene with children who might be struggling at the very outset. I think in the domain of reading, we've learned a tremendous amount about the early predictors of reading achievement and reading success. But we also need to pay attention to early numeracy. So how important are early numerical skills? In 2007, Greg Duncan and his colleagues published a seminal study in developmental psychology where they looked at large data sets from across the world, longitudinal data sets that tracked student achievement from early in schooling to late in schooling. And through meta-analyzing this data, they were able to show how important both reading and math skills are for later reading and later math skills. So how important are these early foundational skills? And one thing that they were able to show is that this is just showing you these studies. So each of these data points is one of these longitudinal studies, and how much the early skills explained in terms of the later skills. So how much the early reading and math skills predicted later reading and math skills. And this is just showing you the prediction for later math skills. And what you can see here is that early math skills predict later math skills more so than do early reading skills. That's not very much of a surprise. But you can see that both reading and math predict later math abilities. Furthermore, on this slide, you can see that skills such as attention, internalizing, externalizing, and social skills early in development did not predict later math skills very well, not as well as early reading and early math skills did. The surprising thing really came when they looked at the prediction of later reading skills. And what they found here was that early math skills predict later reading skills as well as do early reading skills predict later reading skills. So the implication here is then maybe that spending time on numeracy early may have benefits later, not only for math but also for reading achievement. And in general, this study shows the critical importance of early math skills for later achievement. It was sort of a very surprising results to the authors themselves that early math skills not only did very well in predicting later math skills, but it also did quite well in predicting later reading skills. So what should we spend time on early in development? What should we instruct our students? What opportunities for learning should we give them in early math? Typically, when you ask this question, people come up with arithmetic. And surely arithmetic is a critical building block of mathematical abilities. But what I want to demonstrate to you today is that there's lots of other skills that precede the acquisition of arithmetic that we need to pay attention to. And that we need to not solely focus on the development of calculation skills, but consider what kind of building blocks underpin children's ability to learn how to calculate. So arithmetic is not the starting point of math learning. I think that's a very important consideration. Nowadays, when we look at standardized math achievement tests, the assumption that arithmetic is the starting point is embodied in these tests because these tests primarily test arithmetic. But there's a lot of skills underlying the ability to even start to understand what arithmetic is about. And I want to talk about these so-called foundational competencies. So the question I want to ask is, what are the early foundations of math learning, and what is scaffolding math learning early in development? And I want to draw an analogy here to the domain of reading. Phonological awareness has been shown in numerous studies now, large-scale meta-analyses across countries, to be a critical predictor of reading skills. So even before children learn the mapping between sounds and letters, before they have phonics, they have an ability to discriminate sounds in their language. And it turns out that their ability to discriminate sounds in their language is a critical predictor of their later reading abilities. It's a readiness skill. So what I want to look for in a sense in this talk is whether there's a phonological awareness equivalent in the domain of math learning. One of the things that we've learned about phonological awareness is that reading is a very cumulative skill. That means that when you lack phonological awareness early in development, you're going to lag behind. Your developmental trajectory is going to be shallow. Whilst if you've got good foundational skills, if you've got excellent phonological awareness early in development, you're going to have a steep growth. It means that these foundational skills lie at the heart of your reading success, and you build on these foundational skills. This is the so-called Matthew effect in reading, which was termed the Matthew effect in reading by Keith Stanovich at OISE at the University of Toronto. So what do we know about the foundational competencies underlying math? We know that infants have a sense of quantity, and you might ask yourself, how can you say that? That sounds a bit weird. How can infants have a sense of quantity? Clearly, they can't count. They can't look at Arabic numerals and decide whether a 2 is smaller or larger than a 3. Well, one thing that you can do with infants is you can make them look at things. And one of the things you can make them look at in order to understand whether they have a sense of quantity are displays such as this one. This is a dot array of 16 dots. If you look at this, you can't immediately count that there are 16 dots, and certainly an infant can't. And what we do in infant experiments is we make infants bored of a particular stimulus. So in this case, we're going to try to make infants bored of looking at 16 dots. So what we do is we show them different displays of 16 dots over and over again, and critically, we vary everything but the number of dots. So we vary their spatial location, their individual sizes, all of these things we vary, their density and so forth. The only thing that remains constant is the number of items in the display. So the theory is that if infants are essentially habituating or paying attention to number, they will get bored of looking at these displays. And then critically, after showing many, many displays of 16 dots and measuring their looking time using a camera, we introduce a variation. We show them a novel number of dots. In this case, it's 8 dots. And what we're interested in now is whether their looking time recovers, whether they start looking longer at these 8 compared to the 16 dots. And in a seminal work by Xu and Spelke in 2000, it was first demonstrated that infants can indeed discriminate between dot arrays. They can discriminate between 8 and 16. So if an infant is being shown 8, 8, 8, 8, 8, starts to look away, you show them 16 dots, their looking time recovers. However, critically, in this paper, it was also revealed that their sensitivity to numerical differences seems to be very crude. While 6-month-old infants were able to discriminate between 8 and 16 dots, they were not able to discriminate between 8 and 12 dots. In subsequent experiments, it's been found that this numerical discrimination ability becomes more and more refined over developmental time, such that by the age of 9 months, infants are now able to discriminate between 8 and 12 dots, but not between 8 and 10 dots. So there seems to be some refinement in the discrimination ability of very young infants. What this finding shows us then is that infants have a sense of quantity. We also know from work with animals that we share a sense of quantity with other animals. There's lots and lots of work dating back to famous experiments by people like Lawrence and others showing that animals have a rudimentary sense of quantity. I just want to illustrate it by considering one example here, which is a study by Jessica Cantillon and Liz Brannon from Duke University, published in 2005 in Psychological Science. And what they were able to show was that monkeys could be trained to choose the larger of 2 dot arrays on a touch screen, whilst varying all the other parameters such as density, the sizes, and so forth. And they became really good at this. The critical thing is that these monkeys could also generalize their performance. So they could discriminate between 1 to 4 arrays, and after training you would show them 5 to 9 arrays, and they could generalize their discrimination ability from 1 to 4 to 5 to 9, suggesting that they were using some kind of numerical rule in order to perform these discriminations. I'm sorry, the delay of the slides. We also know from neuroscience, this conference is about neuroplasticity, so through functional neuroimaging experiments with young children, even babies, as well as adults, we know that there are brain systems in an area called the intraparietal sulcus in the back of your brain, highlighted here by these green arrows, that is activated when participants perform discriminations between these dot arrays. So you see these brain areas in adults, you see them in younger children, and you can even detect activity in response to changes in the number of items in an array in the infant brain. So all of this data, the infant data, the animal data, the brain imaging data, suggests that we are born with a sense of non-symbolic quantity that we share with other species. So it means that there are some rudimentary foundations that exist in our brain that might help us to acquire more complex mathematical abilities from birth onwards. But the problem gets a little bit complicated because in math, of course, we're not just dealing with dot arrays, we're not just dealing with what we refer to as non-symbolic quantities, but we also deal with numerical symbols. And numerical symbols are cultural inventions. They've been around for approximately 5,000 years. And nowadays, Arabic numerals are almost a universal language of mathematics. You can communicate with somebody in China about numbers and numerical relationships without speaking any Chinese. You couldn't do that about anything else. We trade using these symbols, so they're critical to our everyday lives. So one of the questions then is, how do we unite these two systems? How do we unite our propensity that exists from infancy onwards to be able to discriminate non-symbolic quantities with the symbolic system over developmental time? And one of the things that I'm going to argue in my talk is that children who have mathematical difficulties often struggle with making that integration, with being able to make symbols meaningful, to understand the relationships between symbols and the quantities that they represent. There is now a growing body of research that shows that children's early understanding of numerical symbols is a critical scaffold. So it turns out that having a good understanding of numerical symbols early on facilitates your learning of subsequent skills. An important study was published 2 years ago in the Journal of Educational Psychology called The Transition from Informal to Formal Mathematical Knowledge, Mediation by Numeral Knowledge. What they mean by informal mathematical knowledge is the kinds of skills that we teach children in kindergarten, working with sets, one-to-one correspondence, counting skills, and so forth. What they mean by formal mathematical knowledge is more arithmetic and being able to manipulate symbols. In this study, they took a longitudinal approach and followed a group of children from kindergarten into first grade. And what they were interested in is what variables predict success in making that transition from kindergarten to first grade. And it turns out that numeral identification, so the ability to name numerals, as well as the ability to match numerals to sets, so to be able to say that the symbol 3 corresponds to 3 but not 4 items, were critical mediators of this transition from informal to formal education. So there's a direct educational implication here, which is that in order to help children make the transition from kindergarten into grade 1, we need to ensure that they're able to name their numerical symbols and that they have an understanding of what quantities those numerical symbols refer to. So one of the things we can do on the basis of this result is we can help children build better connections between symbolic and non-symbolic representations of number. And there's some very easy things that we can do that we don't always do. The research shows that we don't do this, and the research shows that elementary education teachers as well as early childhood educators don't necessarily do this as much as they do with literacy, which is to talk about numbers and numerical relations. And for those of you who are parents in the room, do this at home too. Talk about numbers, help your children carve out their worlds in terms of numbers. Numbers are so abstract, one has to help children focus on numbers and numerical relations. Engage students with both symbolic and non-symbolic representations of number. Engage in activities such as counting, naming numbers, comparing them, ordering, in order to help them not only understand the relationships between symbols and the quantities they represent, but also help them understand that numerical symbols are part of ordered sequences, as well as matching numbers to sets. And there's lots of research, great research by people like Robert Siegler at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, showing that number lines are a very powerful tool to help children understand numerical relations, and that things such as playing snakes and ladders enhances children's understanding of the mapping of number into space and the relationships between numbers. When I talk to educators, I often get asked questions about play-based learning, and we already heard this morning just how important play is in early education. And sometimes educators tell me, you talk about symbols, so that must mean we need to use worksheets. We need to sit down our students and give them formal instructions. I want to convince you that there is lots of opportunities to engage with numerical symbols in the context of play-based learning. An emphasis on building children's understanding of number symbols does not have to come at the cost of play-based learning. There's so much research to suggest that play is critical in early education, and I do not want to discourage it. I want to show you some examples, some pictures that I've picked up on social media from educators that I follow of great examples of how to build numerical symbols into play-based learning. Math early on doesn't only have to be about concrete objects. It can also involve symbols, and particularly the relationships between symbols and concrete objects. So these are just some pictures. This is an activity that involves the mapping of symbolic to non-symbolic number. It also involves patterns, so it involves an element of geometry. It involves helping children recognize that number is an abstract property of sets that is invariant to the spatial arrangement of, for example, these dot arrays. It also affords the opportunity to talk about numerical order, these more vertical as well as horizontal relationships between the numbers. Here's another great example of this activity carpet. I just love these. These are fantastic because children can spend hours matching numbers across different notations. Notice well that the second and the third row is really important because it shows children that a number is size invariant. No matter what the font size is, it still represents the same numerical quantity. There are ways of doing relationships here between numbers as well and talking about those. There's lots of other great examples like this. This is one that I just picked up the other week, which I think is fantastic because it's not only about numerical quantity, but it's also about geometry and how quantity and geometrical shapes relate to one another. It's such a rich activity, and it's play-based. This is not something where children are sitting down and writing down numbers or doing things on a computer screen. This involves play-based learning. But it involves numerical symbols, which I think is critical, and helping children to integrate across these different ways of representing the same numerical quantity. Here's another example, and I'm sure that children find this very engaging and a lot of fun to do. I'm just going through the examples, just to illustrate again that there's so many ways of doing this, and always with the integration of the symbolic component, because as you saw in that mediation analysis, numeral identification and being able to map numerical symbols to sets is a critical mediator. It's a bridge between informal and formal education, and often the cutoff between senior kindergarten and first grade, at least as I experienced it in Ontario, is very stark. So helping children achieve that bridge can be very powerful, and using numerical symbols in the case of number, I think, is going to be a very critical component of that. So how do we assess these foundational competencies? How do we assess whether somebody is struggling with their understanding of number symbols or even their understanding of non-symbolic numerical magnitudes? Well, one of the most powerful ways of doing it is actually very simple. It's to ask children to judge the relative magnitude represented by symbols or non-symbolic items such as dot arrays. And number comparison has been shown to be correlated and predictive of math performance in multiple studies across the globe. This is a very vibrant area of research where people are looking for this phonological awareness equivalent in the domain of math and are discovering that it's the rudimentary understanding of the relative magnitude of numerical symbols and quantities that counts. So we have, together with my former PhD student Nadia Nosworthy, we took this work and tried to develop an educational tool from it. And what we decided is to just have a very simple test of magnitude comparison that will only take 2 minutes, that's paper and pencil based, it doesn't require any software or anything like that. Not that I'm opposed to software, by the way, it's just that I sometimes think that educators will favor something that they can hold in their hands. It makes the scoring a little bit more difficult than would be possible in a computer. It has two simple subscales, a non-symbolic and a symbolic subscale. And this is just showing you the first page where the experimenter will illustrate you have to cross out the larger of two dot arrays or the larger of two numbers. Then the child gets some practice, and then they get timed at doing this task. The reason why we're timing them is that we want to see their efficiency of being able to retrieve magnitudes, relate them to one another. Nadia, for her PhD, was able to first validate this measure in a sample of 160 first to third graders in and around the London, Ontario region. She tested them on this 2-minute paper and pencil task, but she also assessed their arithmetic abilities using the Woodcock-Johnson Math Fluency, which is a timed test, do as many problems as you can in 3 minutes, as well as the Woodcock-Johnson Calculation Skill Test, which is an untimed test. It was very important for us to have both timed and untimed components because we know that students differ. Some students are very efficient, very highly mathematically fluent, and other students maybe need more time. So we wanted to assess whether these basic magnitude competencies correlate with both timed and untimed tests. And what Nadia found is when she asked the question, does this 2-minute magnitude processing test correlate with math achievement? The answer is yes. There is a correlation between how well children did on this magnitude comparison test, and in this case, their math fluency scores. The results from the math calculation scores look very similar. What we found when we looked a little bit deeper into the data, however, is that was just showing the overall correlation collapsed across symbolic and non-symbolic. When we dug deeper into the data, we discovered that the symbolic component of the test is really what counts. Whilst both symbolic and non-symbolic correlate, we did find that only symbolic accounts for unique variance in children's arithmetic achievement, and that it did so over other important measures such as working memory, intelligence, and reading abilities. I should note that that doesn't mean that working memory intelligence and reading abilities are not important for math. It just means that this tool, this 2-minute paper and pencil test, buys you an additional explanatory variable. It buys you additional unique variance, as we call it. So the processing of number symbols is critical. And this is a conclusion that is coming out of many different studies that we and others are conducting across the globe. And we therefore believe that early deficits may arise by difficulties in connecting symbols with the more intuitive non-symbolic system. So deficits don't necessarily lie in an impaired non-symbolic system. There's maybe no such thing as an innate deficit in being able to acquire numerical skills, but it's the process of enculturation and the ability to map symbols onto the magnitudes that they represent that is failing in some students. And I think this message is quite positive if you think about it in educational terms. If we had found that the core of dyscalculia, or the core of math difficulties, is in this non-symbolic system that we share with other animals for whom we can detect reliable brain signatures, then it would have been perhaps difficult to find a way to affect that system. However, because we're seeing it's more in the symbolic system, and the symbolic system is something we can teach, I think it suggests that there's maybe a greater amount of plasticity, to use the word of this conference, in these systems than might be suggested by an impairment in the non-symbolic system. Now, we know that correlation does not imply causation, and that's really important. If you see scatter plots like I just showed you, that doesn't mean that one causes the other. So one of the things we need to do is to establish whether this test predicts performance over time. And we were lucky to be able to collaborate with the Toronto District School Board in collecting data from nearly 270 children in senior kindergarten on our paper and pencil task. And then the school board gave us access to their first-year grades, their grade 1 grades in math. So this was in collaboration with the Toronto District School Board, and the school board permitted us access to grade 1 grades. And what we saw when we asked whether symbolic and non-symbolic number comparison skills in kindergarten predict grades in grade 1, we found that that is true particularly for the symbolic version of the task. So in other words, children who did better on this symbolic magnitude comparison task in senior kindergarten were also those who scored higher grades across the 4 strands of the Ontario curriculum. The same was not as true for the non-symbolic test, where we only saw a relationship between non-symbolic in kindergarten and number sense and geometry in grade 1. So we can say with some confidence that individual differences early predict later achievement. We've since, 2 undergraduates and I, put together a website where you can, for free, no cost to you, access this test. You can download it, you can find instructions on how to print it, but you can also find norms for senior kindergarten through to grade 3, norms that we established on the basis of the data we've collected in Ontario. So I should say, for those of you who might be interested in using this in your classrooms here in British Columbia or in other provinces, this is a slight caveat. We, of course, hope to accumulate more data and to create norms. And if you're interested in collaborating with us, please let me know. We're really looking to create this website so that it can be representatives of students not only in this country, but also abroad. It's a highly usable tool. We've, in collaboration with the World Bank, the Education for All initiative, we've been using this tool in other countries. This is just some pilot work in a street school in India. And this is, again, where I say the paper and pencil thing can come in very handy because it's very usable in these different educational settings, if you like. And one aim is to use this tool more broadly to capture individual differences in early numeracy skills in low-income countries. That's something that we aren't doing very well, and we know that numerical literacy translates into financial literacy, and we just know how important financial literacy is in low-income countries, especially for girls. So this is a way in which we're trying to translate this work further. Now, we're at a conference about the brain, so it would be amiss of me not to talk about how this all plays out at the level of the brain, and we are investigating this. So one of the questions that we've been asking is, how does symbolic number processing, which seems to be such a critical scaffold of later math skills, relate to arithmetic achievement at the brain level? And the way we went about this was my former PhD student, Stephanie Bogdans, who's now a postdoc at the University of Pennsylvania, recruited 17 children. Actually, it was a larger sample of children, but for those of you who have been involved in MRI research, you might know that you need to hold still. And you might also know from the students in your classroom that that's kind of a problem early in development. So we need to exclude a lot of students due to head motions. But we had a sample of 17 children. They were between 7 and 9 years of age. And in the fMRI scanner, which is a non-invasive tool to correlate brain activity with a particular task, we asked them to just judge which of two numbers is larger using this symbolic magnitude processing task. And outside of the scanner, we tested them on their math and reading skills using the Woodcock-Johnson. What we were able to do then was to ask which brain regions activated during symbolic number processing actually correlate with children's arithmetic skills. So in other words, are there brain regions where children who process numerical symbols more efficiently are also those children who do better on a standardized test of mathematics? And what Stephanie found was that, first of all, children activated an area, again, in this intraparietal sulcus in the back of their brain, so that's where they showed activation correlated with symbolic number comparison. But more critically, she found that those children who activated this brain region more during symbolic number processing also performed better on the math fluency subtest of the Woodcock-Johnson, but there was no relationship with reading, which is important as well, because maybe this activation is just reflective of general academic abilities. No, it seems to be quite specific to symbolic number processing and the relationship between symbolic number processing and arithmetic achievement. So in other words, the left intraparietal sulcus in this case, it seems to be a mediator in the relationship between symbolic number processing and individual differences in children's arithmetic achievement. I want to talk a little bit about developmental dyscalculia, which is where all this work really is going, which is to try and understand why some children struggle so much with math. And I just want to ask, how many in the room are familiar with developmental dyslexia? How many oh, excellent, great. What about developmental dyscalculia? How comfortable are you with developmental dyscalculia? Definitely a difference there, and that's very common. That's what I see a lot. And we need to build awareness around this condition, because remember from the beginning of my talk, math skills are extremely critical for all sorts of life outcomes. So if we don't help students who are struggling with math, we're putting them at a potential disadvantage over the lifespan. So how do we define developmental dyscalculia? Somebody with developmental dyscalculia has persistent difficulties in mathematics. And this is really critical to point out that this is persistent. You all will have encountered learners who, on one day, do really well on a test, and on another way, they bomb on that test. And there's many reasons why. They might not have had a good night of sleep. We heard about that. They might not have had enough exercise. You know, all these variables that influence students' performance. Or they might just not be paying very much attention. Students with developmental dyscalculia show persistent deficits. That is, there's something more at play than just their waning skills over a school year. It's something is holding them back. And we need to establish that it's below other competencies, such as reading or IQ. The prevalence is around 5%, so it's comparable to developmental dyslexia. Yet the ratio of publications, when you look at the ratio of publications on dyslexia compared to dyscalculia, it's a ratio of for every 14 publications on dyslexia, there's one on developmental dyscalculia. So we really have a problem here in that our knowledge base on this disorder that has potentially very negative adverse effect over the lifespan, our knowledge is significantly less than our understanding of developmental dyslexia. We do have some understanding, though, and I want to review some of the key findings to you. So what underlies developmental dyscalculia? What are the symptoms and causes? If we go back to models of the early 90s, David Geary, the most influential scholar in this field in the early days, proposed this kind of model. This kind of model is interesting because there's all sorts of components that seem to contribute to test performance, or that are thought to be predictive of test performance, such as working memory and counting speed and procedural skills. They're all clearly important skills. But more recently, in the search for the causes, we and others have been asking, what about number-specific processes? And here we really borrowed very heavily from the reading literature, because if you go back on research on developmental dyslexia 2 decades or 3 decades ago, there was a lot of work on factors such as working memory, speed of processing, and so forth, but then the field narrowed much more towards factors that seem to be specific to the acquisition of reading skills, such as phonological awareness and phonics. So we're trying to do the same in the field of developmental dyslexia. And this effort was really kicked off in this paper by Lundell, Bevan, and Brian Butterworth at University College London, who looked at developmental dyscalculia and basic numerical capacities in 8 to 9-year-old children. Their focus was on basic number processing. And in their study, they had several groups of students. They had a group of children with developmental dyslexia, a group of children with developmental dyscalculia, and these were students that were, the dyscalculics were impaired in math but not reading, and the dyslexics were impaired in reading but not math. And they also had a group of students who have both. That, by the way, turns out to be very common. Many students have what we refer to as comorbid developmental dyslexia and dyscalculia. Interestingly, and we can talk more about this in the Q&A, we have yet to find that there's a shared underlying cause. It seems to be more from the available literature that those two things are driven by different deficits and not by a shared underlying cause. And they also had a group of typically developing children, that is children without reading or math deficits. And they did a lot of things in this paper. I want to tell you about the task that I like the most, and that to me is a powerful illustration of the specificity of some of the deficits that children with developmental dyscalculia experience. This is the task, and you can already see that there are two numbers, and the two numbers are printed in different font size. So what we can do is we can ask children to make one of two decisions. We can either ask them to compare the numbers based on their numerical magnitude, or we can ask them to compare those numbers based on their physical size. So which one is taller? And in order to judge which one is taller, you don't really need to think about what those numbers represent. But in order to compare them on the basis of their numerical quantity, you do need to map those symbols to the quantities they represent and then compare them with one another. So what they did is they gave this task to all the 4 groups of students, and what they observed is the following. What you see in the green bars is the performance in terms of how fast they did this task, reaction times, across the 4 groups. You see the controls, the dyslexic, the dyscalculic, and the double deficit group, the dyscalculic dyslexia group. And you can see that they were all relatively fast, and you see no differences between groups. So when children have to judge which one is physically larger, it doesn't matter whether they have dyscalculia or not. They're equally fast. The striking difference comes when you look at the purple bars. Everybody's a little bit slower because it's harder to compare which of two numbers is numerically larger than it is to compare which of two numbers is physically larger. But you can see a striking difference between the first two and the last two groups. The groups that have a math deficit, whether it's comorbid with dyslexia or not, they were significantly slower when they had to compare the two numbers on the basis of their numerical size. This illustrates then that children don't have a general problem with looking at digits and making decisions about them. Their problem lies in accessing the meaning of those symbols and relating them to one another. I think it's a very clear finding, and it's a finding that has been well replicated in the literature as well. So these findings suggest that dyscalculia is, in part at least, a deficit to represent and process numerical magnitude in a typical way. And importantly, one of the conclusions we can draw from this is that super delay. That lack of understanding numerical magnitude early in development leads to deficits in representing numerical expressions and maintaining them in memory. So in other words, the deficit in arithmetic might not be the causal deficit, but it's driven by an underlying difficulty in representing numerical magnitudes. And of course, this happens over the course of learning and development. A developmental perspective on all of these things is so critical. If we think developmentally, then we look for the deep underlying causes rather than just the symptoms. I want to point out that developmental dyscalculia can not only be explained by a deficit in processing number symbols and relating them to numerical magnitude. There are multiple components of developmental dyscalculia. Developmental dyscalculic often have deficits in visuospatial working memory. And one of the things that's really interesting is that the same part of the brain that's involved in visuospatial working memory is also involved in calculation and number representation. Space and number are tied to one another, and space must play a critical role in connecting number symbols to their magnitudes as well. And in this vein, I want to point out that math is really a multi-componential skill, and there are many domains that I haven't talked about today in depth, but I do want to acknowledge that they contribute to typical acquisition of math skills, but also to the breakdown of math skills, and therefore to developmental dyscalculia. One of them is spatial cognition, as I've just mentioned. We see that visuospatial working memory is correlated with math achievement. Working memory in general seems to be very important for math achievement. One of the things that I haven't had time to speak about, but that I just want to spend a few minutes considering, is the role of emotional factors, something that is becoming more and more apparent as we do more research on something called math anxiety. Math anxiety is experienced by many students regardless of whether they have developmental dyscalculia or not. It is often tied to negative experiences they've had in school, or often also to negative experiences that they have at home. There was a recent study published in Psychological Science by Aaron Maloney and Sian Bylock and others at the University of Chicago that shows that children essentially inherit the math anxiety of their parents, and that those children who have parents with very high math anxiety tend to do the worse on standardized tests of math achievement, and that relationship is mediated by how much homework they do together with their parents. And the explanation for that is that, of course, when a math-anxious parent tries to teach a child math, it invariably leads to a highly stressful situation. And that then leads to the transmission of math anxiety across generations. I know it's kind of funny, but actually it isn't, because it's a huge problem, and one that we need to recognize. We also need to recognize that many teachers suffer from math anxiety, and that can rub off on their students. So there's a study again from the Bylock lab in Chicago showing that teachers' math anxiety at the beginning of grade 1 predicts children's math anxiety at the end of grade 1, although the math anxiety of teachers and students was uncorrelated at the beginning. So again, there seems to be this transmission model. So I think we need to consider that also in the way we teach math and in the way we reflect on our own mathematical competencies as educators, and the amount of emotional factors that drive our division of instructional time. This is one of my really big concerns, is that when educators or parents are math anxious, they won't devote time to engaging in mathematical discussions and conversations about numbers. And often this math anxiety is based around learning algebra or fractions. It's not about deciding which of two numbers is larger or matching digits to dot arrays, but that's what children need early in development. And those aspects may get avoided because of a math anxiety that's related to the higher level skills. So the emotional factors are really, really critical. We need to pay attention to that. Phonological awareness turns out to be important for math as well. So we and others have shown strong correlations between phonological awareness and arithmetic achievement. So reading plays a role in math, and math potentially plays a role in reading as well. Executive functions, inhibitory control, being able to control your actions. We heard about the prefrontal cortex as a critical region here. The prefrontal cortex is activated when you do math problems. And inhibitory control as a psychological construct has been shown to be related to math achievement. Language is an important consideration in math. We live in such a multicultural, multilingual culture. We need to recognize that numbers are represented in different ways across languages. Some languages represent numbers more transparently than others. Take, for example, the teens. In English, we say 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, and then we say 21, 31, 42, 53. We never go back to that way of organizing numbers in our language. In other languages, for example, in Chinese, it's 10-1, 10-2, 10-3. That's much more intuitive for children, and there's work showing that children who grow up in China acquire an understanding of the magnitude represented by numbers in the teens earlier than those do in English-speaking countries. So we need to consider language as a variable as well. And basic number processing, which I focused a lot of attention to today. But the point of this slide is that really all of these competencies are important for math, and importantly, they're all related to one another. And teachers, let's not forget teachers. Teachers are so critical in students' math achievement. If you've read the work of John Hattie, Visible Learning, you will know that teachers are the #1 predictor of student outcomes. and relationships between these domains. I couldn't fit more arrows on this page, but they're meant to be more arrows. This is meant to be a giant spider web of interrelationships. And most critically, perhaps, this needs to be considered in a developmental perspective. We too often cherry pick certain skills without considering the learning level and the age of the learner. We need to consider that basic number processing is important early on, but later on, skills such as executive function and working memory become more important as you engage in multi-digit calculation and in holding things in mind. So we need to look at this developmentally, and we need to consider these emotional factors and how early negative experiences in learning really can affect the developmental trajectory. And I think a lot of students who we call dyscalculic may actually be math anxious. And one of my major aims, which is keeping me up at night, is to try and find a way in which we can dissociate these two and discover their underlying relationships over developmental time. Now, we are at a conference at Neuroplasticity and Education, and I do want to say a few words about it. I'm currently serving as the president of the International Mind, Brain, and Education Society. I've been in the field of neuroscience and education for a long time now and have thought a lot about it, and there's just some things that I want to share, some reflections that I think are useful when we consider the potential of neuroplasticity. Education changes the brain. That's kind of a no-brainer. But still, it's a very motivating sentence, I think, and we've seen lots of examples today that there is experience-dependent plasticity. The brain changes as a function of our experiences. Your brains are being changed in physical ways, as Dr. Mersony said, just by listening to us. Whether in good ways or bad ways, I'll leave that to you. So teachers are in many ways, or educators in general, the orchestrators of neuronal plasticity. And that's, of course, why understanding the brain can lead to changes in practice. But this bridge between neuroscience and education is non-trivial. Understanding of how education changes the brain can also inform neuroscience. So we've got a sort of bidirectional bridge with traffic flowing from one side to the other. Currently, the traffic from neuroscience to education is stronger than the traffic from education to neuroscience, but I really predict that will change. We need you to tell us what to look at. We need your experiences. I don't spend any time in classrooms. I can't, because I'm a professor at a university and there's too many other things to do. So I need educators' input and observations, and many observations that I've been told about have informed our research. But we also need to be very cautious about this bridge between neuroscience and education. There are lots of products that are marketed as brain-based, and I'm really concerned about that, because the fascination with the human brain, which is a justifiable fascination, it's what drives me to work every morning, can be exploited. We always need to ask the question whether there are peer-reviewed studies that provide evidence for the efficacy of something that claims to be brain-based. And we also need not to forget about the rich behavioral work that we can do. I intentionally focused most of my talk on basic cognitive psychological work to illustrate that behavioral work is sometimes even more powerful than something we can learn from brain imaging, because we can test larger population, we can ask more questions. That's not to say that brain imaging isn't useful. I'm a great fan of it. We do it very much in my lab. We use this tool very much. And how valid are the claims that are being made? And I tell you, the problem is that there are lots of neuromyths around. For example, we only use 10% of our brain. Or one neuromyth that often educators get really shocked about, that there's no evidence behind it, is this notion of learning styles. That there's some visual learners, some auditory learners, and tactile learners. There's a beautiful review that's available for free online by Harold Pashler from the University of California, San Diego, that talks about the evidence for learning styles, and it turns out to be nil. In terms of that, you could classify learners as a function of learning either through the visual, auditory, or tactile modality. Learning is multimodal. We know that. The areas of the brain that are critical for things like math receive inputs from multiple modality. They're so-called heteromodal areas of the brain. The left and right brain thing is still around. This, when you use Google, if you search a lot for the brain, you get these kinds of ads. And for several weeks last summer, I constantly got this ad in my sidebar. It drove me crazy, because there's so many things wrong about it. There cannot be a 30-second test to establish any aspect of brain function in any meaningful way, let alone whether you use your left hemisphere more than your right. And the other thing is that there's constant communication between the hemispheres. One of the wonderful things about having two hemispheres is that there's redundancy built into the brain. That is, if you've got removal of one hemisphere early in life because you've got such heavy epileptic surgeries, say removal of the left hemisphere, you can recover through neuronal plasticity function in the other hemisphere that doesn't typically specialize for that function. So this is just bogus, this hemispheric stuff. The problem is that there are lots of myths of neuroscience and education, and this is a paper that I highly recommend by Paul Howard-Jones in Nature Reviews Neuroscience. And one of the things he discusses is neuromyths and how prevalent they are. And this is not to criticize teachers. Teachers are not at fault here. It's what we do in teacher training, what we do in professional development, where we must try to counteract these myths. This is just showing across a number of studies, United Kingdom, China, Greece, Turkey, the prevalence of these things such as we use only 10% of our brain. And the reason why I want to talk about this is because I think there's a real risk of neuromyths, because if we endorse neuromyths, then time can be spent on activities that are actually not beneficial. And that's a wrong use of instructional time. Again, instructional time is one of my biggest concerns, like instructional time for math or for anything. How does one divide instructional time? And it can lead to a wrong characterization of learners, as we see in the visual, auditory, and kinesthetic learning styles type of notion. And we always need to, and Professor Merzenich talked about this, the issue of transfer. How transferable are trained skills? We don't just, for example, want to make people better at working memory. We want to train up their working memory so that they can use it in domains that really matter to them in their lives and in their classrooms. I have great hopes for the connection between neuroscience and education. I'm so heartened to see so many of you in this room today who are excited about this. But I do think we need to tread carefully, and we need to think critically about the kinds of products that are being put in front of us. And I think that's an important part of this evolving field. But I do think there's going to be a lot going from neuroscience to education, but critically also from education back to neuroscience. And at universities, we need to establish the right infrastructure to make that happen. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much for your attention, and happy to take any questions in the Q&A session, right? Yeah, and so if in the beginning of the talk you thought, yeah, that's right, I'm mathematically challenged, this is to make you feel better right now. Thank you.